Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to this installment of the Conservation Lecture Series. The lecture series is brought to you by the Department of Fish and Wildlife Science Institute. My name is Whitney Albright. I'm a climate change specialist with the department and part of the Science Institute team. And before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I wanted to go through a few quick announcements. First, we have scheduled our next talk for September. It'll be taking place on September 10th from 1 to 3 p.m. It's just 2 weeks away, so it's coming up soon. And at that talk, we'll hear from Dr. Lisa Michelli with the Pepperwood Foundation about what they're doing to advance landscape resilience in their area, especially in the face of increasing wildfire risks. So it should be an interesting talk. The registration link for that talk is available for the public, for our partners. That link's available on the Conservation Lecture Series website. For DFW staff, we encourage you guys to register through LEARN, through the Office of Training and Development. Those links should be available, posted to the website. You'll also receive an email with them in the next day or two, so please keep an eye out for those. Okay, for today, a few quick ground rules. If you could please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. For folks on the phone, if you could, you're all on a universal mute. If you could type any questions that you have into the chat box, I'll make sure to relay those to our speakers so that we can answer those questions as well. So please help me to welcome Chrissy Atkinson, our guest speaker today. Chrissy is with the California Department of Water Resources. She is a part of their riverine stewardship section of the Special Restorations Initiatives branch. And Chrissy was formerly a senior environmental scientist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she worked on fisheries monitoring, different management, and restoration issues. She was also the chair of both the science and management teams for the California Coastal Monitoring Plan for salmon and steelhead, as well as a coordinator for DFW's drought monitoring response and hatchery reform. Her background, Chrissy has a background in biology from UC Santa Cruz and a master's degree in organismal biology from San Jose State University. So please help me in welcoming Chrissy Atkinson.
Thank you for the introduction, Whitney, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, and it's great to see all these familiar faces from the past. I will be talking to you today about California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the drought stressor monitoring response from 2014 through 2017. Yes, if you've heard from Whitney, as of recently, I now work for California Department of Water Resources. Because this effort was done as a CDFW scientist, I will be presenting this from that viewpoint. Trying to figure out how to work this mouse. Oh, let's see. Yeah, how do I? Before it's over. Okay, I'll just get going.
It wouldn't be a meeting without a technician.
Yeah. So as I just mentioned, this was a major collaborative effort of 57 co-authors throughout the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Here's a list of the regional staff who contributed to the writing portion from CDFW's regions 1 through 6. CDFW is comprised of 7 regions, and so this is truly a statewide effort of all regions except for the Marine region. Please note there's also a number of staff that are not listed here that contributed. They contributed in the field work efforts and data analysis. I've listed here the staff who have who contributed to the writing efforts. And from a statewide perspective, there was a couple branches and an office that participated. As you can see here, staff participated in coordination of the effort. Basically, fisheries branch staff, what staff did was we coordinated the writing of this major report. We got spreadsheets from staff statewide. Every 2 weeks, people were sending us their Excel spreadsheets, and we were compiling all that data. We were giving it to leadership, and leadership put it up the food chain to let the state know what we're doing. The Office of the Biogeographic Data Branch staff, they worked with the mapping components, and the Office of Communication was really important in helping us craft the statewide report. So when I begin this talk, I just want to kind of take us back to when the drought was beginning. And what we didn't know was basically what the duration would be, or the intensity. As we were diving into the drought, I was looking at a lot of the literature, as I imagine a lot of you were, and what we read in the literature was they were finding that there was droughts that lasted for multiple decades, and they were primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries, and we had no idea what we were entering into. But as you can see, by the year 2013, it was getting pretty dry. We were getting into extreme drought situations. So by January 14th, 2014, then Governor Brown issued a state of emergency for California. And he basically gave out this directive that all of the states will do all necessary actions to ameliorate the drought conditions. So what happened? The drought ended up lasting for about 5 years, from 2012 to 2016, and California experienced one of the warmest and driest periods on record. In 2017, the governor ended his declaration of emergency for drought, but the governor also maintained that drought emergency in the lower San Joaquin watershed that was still exceptionally dry. So here we are, we're in a drought, and suddenly the Department of Fish and Wildlife has to prepare for all necessary actions. And because many of the species in California are listed on the Endangered Species Act, or Species of Special Concern, they were certainly at risk of impact with the drought. And it's the charge of the Department of Fish and Wildlife as a trustee agency of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And so we had to jump into action to figure out how we were going to monitor fish and what management actions we were to take. There's also a need to balance water resources for humans. We share them with animals, and so we need to make sure we had the best science. So in preparing and jumping into this drought, what we also did was we looked at past files to see what California Department of Fish and Wildlife did in the past or previous droughts, and we couldn't find anything. Certainly district biologists probably had information in their files, and there were some reports out there, but from what we could find, we couldn't see any statewide level report. And then we wondered what the other states were doing. Some quick Google searches. It's unclear if they actually did something comprehensive like the Department of Fish and Wildlife attempted to do, but there are some information out there. So here's an overview of the talk. We're going to be talking, and I'm going to be presenting in kind of a scientific format framework. I'm going to be talking about the methods we use, the results. There's 3 major questions that the scientists were tasked with answering. And then we'll talk about the discussion and kind of lessons learned through this exercise. And also, I want to be clear too, can't see my notes on this computer. I'm having technical issues. But, as I said before, this was a major statewide effort. There's 57 co-authors. I was basically the lead author of that. And so basically, so those of you on the phone or those of you that contributed to collecting this data, at the end, if there's specific questions about data in those geographic areas, I welcome you all to kind of help answer those questions. And I also see at the end of this discussion, when this presentation is over, there's kind of a time maybe to we can reflect on what we did and kind of what we could have done or where we could be, what we could do better next time. So basically, there are a couple of major goals of what the effort was. And in number one, the primary goal was we wanted to get a snapshot of what the drought was doing and how it was affecting aquatic species across the state. The other part of it was if species are on the edge of blinking out, we had to make some management decisions, and we wanted it to be based on science. We didn't want people just moving fish around. You'll hear in these talks, a lot of fish were moved around, but we wanted it to be based on sound science. And Roger Bloom's group and others in the state fisheries management committee, they came up with this fish rescue matrix. I think that was thought to be very, very strategic. It basically required where you go out there and monitor the populations, and then you look at what the environmental factors are, the water quality, and then it's a kind of a strategic process in which you make decisions on what you do with those fish and the risk level of those fish. So we exercised kind of management. We tried to balance the management and the science on strategically using tools such as the rescue matrix. Well, it says here we focused on 17 species and 141 watersheds. And the reality is, yes, there's 17 species mentioned, but a lot of focus, the overwhelming focus was on salmonids, salmon, steelhead, and trout. Those species are listed under, as I said earlier, sensitive species. Many are listed under the Endangered Species Act. They're also a sensitive species. They like cold, clear, well-oxygenated water, and they're very sensitive to water quality changes. And so that makes them a good candidate to look at what's happening with the environment. So the 141 watersheds, so this is a statewide project, as I said, and the challenge was, from a statewide perspective, I asked people statewide, what are our priority streams to focus on? And of course, the biologists just want to save everything. They're worried about everything, and so that's a good thing. But then the problem is with limited resources, staff, time. They already have full-time jobs before this drought started. We had limited money. We were given $3 million from the governor on this project, and so what we did is we tried to get people to kind of narrow it down on a lower list of watersheds and kind of look at those watersheds in greater detail. So again, kind of the general directive from Sacramento, working with the regions was scientists were asking, so what do we do? What do we do? And it's like, we just gave them kind of really high level questions to answer. And we have a bunch of statewide monitoring programs. They're not fully implemented. They're not fully funded. And so, what we had to do is we had to take an opportunistic approach. There's a lot more monitoring in Northern California versus Southern California. A lot of these places we monitored, they didn't have any monitoring previously. Most of the monitoring is done in Southern California or Northern California, and so basically in a lot of areas they were monitoring for the first time. So keep that in mind when you think about what it was like to. So we're suddenly doing our jobs, and then suddenly we have these big questions about species statewide, and we have to do something, and we have to show something, and we have to hurry up and do that. So I talked a little bit about the methods. Again, some of the photos up there kind of show the different sampling methods that were used statewide, seining, rotary screw traps, electrofishing, snorkel surveys. And so we were opportunistic on what we looked at. We looked at sensitive species in the high priority locations. That's kind of how we picked our watersheds. We had weekly reporting that, again, came from the regional staff, the field staff. It's Excel spreadsheets, and Sacramento had to compile them and get them ready for leadership. We had case studies we were putting on the website. There's 38 of them, so congratulations to everybody that helped with that. And then there's several videos I'll talk about that the department made, as well as some of our NGO partners, which are pretty insightful and tell a story about what happened to different species with the drought.
Okay, you should be good, Chrissy. Okay.
So we're going to start with the first question, and I'm going to show you kind of snapshots throughout the state, and I want you guys to also think about, and I kept doing this repeatedly when I was writing this report, is I kept wanting context. Some of the area, like I said, has long-term monitoring, and that was very effective at kind of helping us with context of what the data means. In many cases, they were just snapshots because we had never, or at least it had been a long time, or we had never gone out there and actually done the monitoring. So the way I see this is an excellent baseline of what we found. So maybe it was the first data that was collected. That's data, and it shows a snapshot in time, and that's very helpful. It's can serve as a baseline. So in general, our stream's drying. So not surprisingly, the general patterns were that the streams that usually characterize as wet, they dried up in places. That happened probably in most streams across the state, and then streams that were typically intermittent, they often dried up completely, and isolated pools that were once safe havens, you had water quality deteriorate, and suddenly they were no longer safe havens for fish. So here's an example of answering this question. This is Southern California at Steelhead in Ventura County, and yes, there's steelhead that go down to San Diego County, which I think is pretty cool. So the staff down there did a really good job, I thought. What they did is they showed the drying of streams. To the left, you can see this Arroyo Hondo Creek in Ventura County in 2005 or 2015. And what they show each month is the rapid drying. The red is the drying reaches, and the blue lines are the wetted reaches. So very quickly, you really lost steelhead habitat, and I think most of you are aware. What's key to know here is the steelhead life history stages are they basically spawn and rear in the stream, and then they go out to the ocean for growth, and then they return to spawn. So basically, drying up the stream in the summertime and throughout the year, that basically affects all the life stages. It affects rearing. It affects spawning. It affects the fish's ability to get into the streams to access for spawning, and it affects outmigration. So it could have severe effects on the steelhead life history. So on the right side we have Matilaha Creek. It's a tributary of the Ventura River, and then we have Cesar Creek, a tributary of the Santa Clara River in 2016, and staff were able to go out there and again map the wet and dry areas. Blue lines are wetted and red lines are dry. And what they found out was not only what the impacts were, but they were able to kind of target streams that were drying out, and potentially where they may need to do rescues, because the steelhead down in Southern California are actually endangered. They're not threatened like they are in Central California. They're actually endangered. There's very few left, and so they were using their rescue matrix, and they were making decisions on where to relocate the fish. The obvious trouble here is when the stream is drying up, where do you put the fish? That becomes the obvious problem, and that required monitoring to make sure the places they were putting the fish had cold, clear, oxygenated water. So that was another challenge. One long-term restoration planning information that they learned that I found was, and I think they found was pretty helpful, was they got a sense of where you have flowing water during an extreme drought. You know, basically the refugia would be for steelhead in these extreme situations, and I think that might be important from a long-term restoration planning perspective. Those are places, you know, that we probably want to keep an idea of where they are, and we want to make sure that they're protected and that access to and from those places for steelhead during these dry seasons is protected. So moving up to the Central Coast, this is Santa Cruz County. Staff did something kind of similar, a little bit different colors on the map at Scott Creek, Santa Cruz County. So the green is the wetted stream, and the reds are the dry stream bed, and the yellows kind of in between. And so Scott Creek is home to steelhead are threatened there, but it's also home to endangered coho, which are pretty close to being extinct. And so, so this was an important watershed for the biologists on the Central Coast to look at, you know, what the conditions were for steelhead and coho salmon during the drought. The figure to the right shows the San Lorenzo River. It's the main river that flows through Santa Cruz and exits near the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. And what they found was during the drought of 2015, 2016, you had really low flows. But then by 2016, 2017, you could see how the winter flows, there was near record-breaking winter flows after the drought. So the fish were barely making it during the drought, and then some record-breaking flows that might have actually been difficult for spawning in the sense of blowing out reds once the fish are successfully able to spawn, but access was really good. So this was good data that staff on the Central Coast collected. So now we're going to go on to the next kind of big topic that we found in California was, are the streams warming and are there population effects? So again, we looked at places all over the state. We looked at Shasta County. We looked at the Noyo River in Mendocino County, and we had varying results. And again, it would be nice to have kind of standardized methods throughout the state so we can actually statistically tell you whether or not the stream temperature in California is warming. So instead, we have kind of these snapshots that I'm going to walk you through. And in general, what we found was in many places, the water temperature was reasonable for salmon and steelhead. It wasn't too hot. But that wasn't the case in a lot of areas. And I'm going to tell you about some of the cases where temperature became a problem. So the classic example is winter run Chinook salmon. They basically they're endangered, and they migrate into the Sacramento River in the winter, and then they come and hold up and spawn in the upper Sacramento near Redding. And as you guys probably all know, Redding gets to over 100 degrees easily in the summertime. So they come up. They hold around the end of April through the end of the summer, and then they spawn. And what's key is to maintain cold water in the upper Sacramento River. They're particularly sensitive to temperatures, and they only live downstream of Shasta Dam. They used to live upstream of Shasta Dam before the dam was built, and so they're in the main stem, and they're highly susceptible to temperatures downstream of the dam. And as you can see on the far right picture, this was Shasta Dam, January 16, 2014. This is 2 days after the governor declared a state of emergency. You can check out Mount Shasta right here. There's very little snow, and this is January. And so that was concerning. So check out the temperatures. This is what happened with the temperature in 2014, 15, and 16. So what happened was there's actually a temperature, there's a criteria where they try to run water downstream of Shasta to keep it cold to a certain point. And let me look, I'm trying to see my notes just to remember what that is. It's called the Clear Creek Temperature Gauge. And that's at 13.3 degrees Celsius. That's what they try to keep the temperature at. But because of the limited cold water pool of the Shasta Reservoir and just lack of water across the state and balancing water needs, they had to move the compliance point upstream, and they moved it up to 13.9 as the threshold from 13.3. So they moved it up, so that kind of shrunk the cold water habitat in the Sacramento River. And this is kind of what we found. We found in 2014 and 2015, it exceeded the black line, as you can see. The dotted line is the new threshold. But then in 2016, the water temperatures were down, and it clearly met the threshold. That was because the rainy season improved, and there was a better snowpack, and it kind of reset things back in 2016, 2017. So what was the biological outcome of these temperature effects? So what biologists found, well, you can check out the photo to the left. That's a dewatered winter run red. This is in Redding. So there was dewatering of reds. To the right is a photo of a biologist out there assessing reds. And it was concerning with the water temperature and the flows. I think the criteria was set to basically look at survival of eggs in the nests that are particularly sensitive to temperature. So what biologists found that which is not surprising, the fish kind of redistributed themselves kind of based on where the cold water was. And so in doing spawning surveys assessments, that's what they found is, as you can see, the 2003 to 2013 average, it was around, you can see 43, 43, and 14. And then 2014 and 2015, the distribution of salmon and spawning kind of changed to kind of, as they tried to find the cold water. So the figure to the right, the biologists, they have a rotary screw trap, and so they were able to look at egg to fry survival, which was, they have a little bit more in-depth monitoring than elsewhere in the state, which was fantastic. They were able to kind of get an idea of, here we have a temperature criteria, and here we have some reds. What does this all mean? And they certainly did find that survival rates were lower in 2013 through 2015, but during the driest time in California's recent history. But then 2016, once we had decent rains and we had a good snowpack, their survival went up to 24%, which was consistent with pre-drought levels. So that was a good thing. So basically, kind of the take-home message for this is that monitoring was very helpful. It kind of showed us a snapshot of how fish were faring here during the drought, but it also kind of gave us an idea of looking at survival, looking at flows and temperatures, and using some equations, we could probably forecast different water flow scenarios and temperature scenarios, and we might be able to get a picture of how salmon are doing. It also kind of makes us think about how to build a resiliency for the future. If salmon are below this dam and we have climate change, we have a changing environment, we need to kind of think about how we build in resiliency into the systems. So now moving on to another classic case of temperature. This is spring run Chinook salmon. This is the population in Butte Creek in Butte County. It's right near Chico. Butte Creek drains into the Sacramento River. And I love this picture to the left. It's a picture of adult spring run in this deep pool in the canyon area of Butte Creek. I want to be there right now swimming. So are the streams warming? What are the population effects? Well, here the criteria was set for basically the adults in the pools, and that was around 20 degrees for the spring run Chinook. And what the biologists in that area, what they did is they did a whole bunch of snorkel surveys to look at the condition of the spring run before they spawn. And again, they're holding kind of like the winter run, they're holding over the summer and then they spawn in the fall. And so, you know, Chico gets to over 100 degrees too. And so they're really dependent on these cold, deep pools for cold water temperature. And so biologists, they monitor the stream looking for adults, and then they try to assess. They also looked at the adults that died before they spawned. They call them pre-spawn mortalities. And so the bars on the two figures to the left, the gray and the black bars, those represent the salmon that died before they were able to spawn. And it's thought that they died from the heat. So, and the red lines at the top, those are the temperatures and how they compare to the criteria. And as you can see, in both years, a lot of fish died, and the temperatures were really warm. Another thing to point out here, the local biologists did a great job collaborating with PG&E, the State Water Resource Control Board, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they have this team that basically looks at the water temperature. They look at water operations, and they work as a team, and they kind of were able to kind of shift the way the water was managed up there, and they were able to try to keep it as cool as they could. And that's also, and for hydroelectric areas, you have to realize too that there's a lot of demand on water. So the summer is a tricky balancing act for fish and energy and all those needs. So another example of warming temperatures, so we'll talk about the San Joaquin River watershed. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the governor in 2017, he ended his state of emergency for drought. Well, he kept it, or 2000, I better check. He kept it for, in April 7th, 2017, he ended the state of emergency for drought, except he kept it for the San Joaquin counties because this was still exceptionally dry. And so the animals to be concerned about in the San Joaquin watershed, fall run Chinook, there's threatened steelhead, and there's staff in the upper San Joaquin watershed. They're working with the San Joaquin River Restoration Program, and they're trying to reintroduce spring run Chinook salmon downstream of Friant Dam near Fresno. And so that would be another challenge, is trying to keep the water cold below Friant Dam. But they haven't quite yet reintroduced the fish at that point during the drought. They were kind of in the prep stage of designing a conservation hatchery and kind of the steps that would lead up to that. So are the streams warming? So this is the San Joaquin. This is kind of just a snapshot. What I did was, the figure to the left is the upper San Joaquin near Friant Dam, and then the one to the right is the lower San Joaquin River. So kind of just in a quick snapshot, what this says is downstream of the dam, it's cold. It's a good thing that's where the spring run Chinook will go. So let's see, the dotted line is the lower line on the left. That's just downstream of the dam. But then you get to the solid line, that gets to 30 degrees, which is really hot for steelhead. I mean, ideally steelhead would be in the upper limits would be in the high teens. They can tolerate some low 20s, but 30 degrees is probably lethal for steelhead. So that's concerning. So the figure to the right, the point of that one, is as you go further downstream and you don't have the influence of the dam, you don't really have much of a differential between upstream and downstream temperatures. They're fairly similar. The flows are different, but the temperatures are fairly similar. Local scientists in the area also reported that they believe temperature increases were also due from agricultural runoff. That could be one of the pieces of increasing water temperature. So now let's talk about the Merced River. The Merced River, as most of you guys know, it starts in Yosemite, one of my favorite places. But what was monitored here was the lower Merced in the area of Anadromite, and Merced River is a major tributary of the San Joaquin River. So what you can see here is scientists measured water temperature and flow, and kind of like we talked about before, downstream of the dam, you had really cold water. But then the farther you go downstream, it warms up. It's a cooker. It gets up to 30 degrees. And there was times when even the dam, when it was releasing water, got over 21 degrees. And so when it starts out warm and it continues downstream and 100 degrees sometimes weather, it just heats it even more. And so tough to be a steelhead or a Chinook salmon in that watershed. If you're a steelhead, you want to be downstream of that dam and in the cool water. They also found during the several years of drought, the lower Merced River actually dried up completely. And so that was in the kind of late summer, early fall. And so likely, Chinook salmon, that or come up there in the fall, it's possible that there could have been some stranding Chinook salmon or impacts to Chinook salmon. And then steelhead for sure, trying to rear in the summer when it's 30 degrees. If they're not next to the dam, they'll be in trouble. So when we thought, oh, now the fish get a break, it's the winter time, the temperatures have cooled down, the fish could just kind of relax. There's a problem with the river being hydrologically connected, but at least maybe if there's a cold pool, maybe they can kind of relax. Well, this was not the time of relaxation was not the time in the Sierra. There was often trout what's expected or thought to be anchor ice and possible freezing of trout in the Sierras. And the possible freezing, so what we have here is we had reduced snowpack, and actually the snowpack is a great insulator in the winter for trout streams. They keep the streams that are running below them from basically freezing. And then when you have a reduced snowpack and you have possibly sub-zero degree weather, and you have very low flow, it's easier for those streams to start freezing. And we think that might have been a cause for some of the mortalities in the Sierra streams. So an example of one of the monitoring projects that was worked on is the California golden trout. These are found to have a unique genetic strain. They're in Tulare County in the Sierra. So what biologists out there did is they went out there and they assessed habitat. They basically, they had to hike many miles to even get to these creeks. And it's not something that they can, they kept telling me. So Sacramento was receiving data from people weekly, and they would remind Sacramento staff, oh, we can't go out there. Well, theoretically, there's a bunch of snow, but it's quite the hike to get up there into the Sierra to do this monitoring. So in the summer, they go out there and looked at the extent of wetted habitat, and what was alarming to them was in Volcanic Creek, at one of the sites, the wetted habitat decreased by 50%, and there's not a whole lot of habitat to begin with. And so that's a big reduction. And then they also saw a sharp reduction in the population by 81%, which was huge. They had temperatures loggers in the streams, and they found that the water temperature got to 0.1 degrees Celsius, and it's believed that it could hit zero to freezing. So there's a lot of concerns, and so what biologists end up doing is they brought packers up there, and they ended up rescuing this remaining population of California golden trout and bringing it to East Sacramento to the Nimbus hatchery and putting them in these recirculating tanks to keep them on life support. So they did a pretty heroic job of doing that, and that was a lot of work. I think it'd be pretty terrifying. Just you're trying to carry these fish. You're on horses, and then these tanks could spill, and then you basically lost the fish. And so there's a lot of responsibility taking these fish back to the hatchery. So after a while at the hatchery, scientists kept monitoring the stream conditions up there in the Tulare County, and they found that the stream conditions improved, and so they were successfully able to reintroduce these fish back into their native streams. And so that's a great story, and I'll be telling you at the end. There's a video that was done on this it's very interesting, and I recommend you check it out. So is the amount of dissolved oxygen changing? Well, what scientists found throughout the state that dissolved oxygen wasn't a big deal in many of the streams that had flowing water, but what they did find that in some areas, especially in Southern California, was when the flows got really low and then you had a lot of biological oxygen demand. There was times when the oxygen even got to deleterious levels. So, and the other piece of it is the scientists found in estuaries, and I'll be talking about in estuaries or barbel lagoons where you had less freshwater input. You had basically situations where you had higher tidal influence, you had less mixing, and both temperature and oxygen became an issue, which we'll be talking about. So first we'll talk about Coldwater Canyon Creek. So this is in Riverside County. They have some really big resident trout there that are pretty cool. They're kind of unique looking when I look at them. So what they found in Coldwater Canyon Creek, as you can see to the figure to the left, the dissolved oxygen got really low. It got down to 1. And then the temperature, let's see. Yeah, the temperature wasn't that bad, but at 20 degrees with low oxygen, the fish, their metabolism goes up with temperature, and then when you have depletion of oxygen, that could mean trouble for trout. So biologists were worried about that, and they did kind of what they did in Tulare County. They took these fish and they brought them to Fillmore Hatchery. First, they brought them to Fillmore Hatchery. Actually, they brought them there, I think, twice. The first time was because the stream was drying up, and then the second time was the stream was drying and the dissolved oxygen was crashing. And so they were brought to Fillmore Hatchery, and they used this hatchery for basically holding them temporarily until the streams, the flows improved and the conditions improved. Then they put them back in Coldwater Canyon Creek. Well, then around that time, there's big fires around the creek, and then there was risk of sedimentation being, blown into the water, and so they could use this, unique strain of rainbow trout. And so what they ended up doing, after talking to pathologists and geneticists, what they ended up doing is rescuing the fish again to the Fillmore Hatchery, and then they ended up putting the fish into a different watershed, Marion Creek, in Riverside County. They felt like this other creek was too risky, and they kept having to rescue them. And then they felt like, from a genetics and pathology standpoint, it was acceptable to put them in this nearby Marion Creek. So as I mentioned, the dissolved oxygen temperature could be a problem in barbel estuaries or barbel lagoons and affect estuaries. We have Pescadero Lagoon in San Mateo County on the left. We had some research in Humboldt Bay Estuary on the right. So here's an example, Pescadero Lagoon. So this lagoon suffers some hydrology issues and water quality issues. And so, but it's the example we have to work with. So, so what we found here, you can see on the water quality profile on the graph on your right. And what you can see, so on the y-axis is the depth, starting from 0 down to 0.75. And then across the x-axis, we have an idea of what the temperature and salinity and dissolved oxygen are doing by depth. And as you can see, the water temperature is between 25 and 30 degrees throughout the entire water column. And like we talked about before on the San Joaquin, that's a cooker for steelhead that would be rearing in this lagoon. Steelhead, lagoons are excellent, generally supposed to be excellent habitat for rearing steelhead, but those temperatures are way too high for steelhead. And then you could notice the beige line, that's a salinity. And what that shows is you had saltwater intrusion, or you had tidal influence, and you had very little fresh water on the surface. Even the surface had between 5 and 10 parts per thousand, so that had some salt in it. You had lack of mixing because you had a layered system, and so you had really low dissolved oxygen down to 5. It starts at 10 and then down to 5, but again, at those high temperatures, the fish are going to need more oxygen because they have higher metabolisms, but between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius is really cooking for a steelhead. The biologists went out there and seined a couple of times in July, and then in 2015, and then in 2016. The first time they seined in July, they found about 2,000 steelhead. By October, they couldn't find any steelhead. And then 2016, the number jumped up, and then by the end of 2016, there was more than in 2015. And I'm not really quite clear what that means. I think it's my understanding that the rainy season, I think we got a big storm event in October 2016, but yeah, it surprises me to see the numbers as high as 1,500 in 2016. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. So we had those 3 main questions that we've been talking about, and then as you're a biologist, you're out in the field, and then it's like there's other issues, that we're faced with, looks like with drought and mudslides and fires and all sorts of things. You're the biologist, you're trying to figure out what the heck's going on, and it feels like chaos. So we're seeing that in Northern California, but we've been seeing that a lot in Southern California is, dry areas. You don't have regular stream flows that are pushing out the sediment transport, and so you have a building of sediment. So it just, once you start getting the high rain events, it could be a flash, flood flow or mudslide into systems, which is not good for aquatic species. And so biologists were looking at this kind of thing, and it kind of made me at least start thinking, is this something we should be thinking about? Is this kind of a window into what more of California might be seeing in the future? So I know you guys just wanted to hear talk about a fish other than a salmonid. So I threw in the endangered and fully protected unarmored stickleback in the Santa Clara River watershed. They're a pretty cool fish. They only live in 3 counties, and they're, small scaleless freshwater fish up to 2 inches long. And they only live for a year, so that's another interesting part of their life history. They need to reproduce, or they can just blink out. So these events could be trouble. So here we're going to be talking about the Santa Clara River watershed, like I mentioned, and kind of what the biologists did down there. So kind of like the Coldwater Canyon Creek, the stream was drying up. They had to do a lot of rescues. And that's what they did in the Santa Clara River. So the stickleback kind of prefer clear water that's vegetated, and it has some complex habitat and kind of these small pools. And so here they are. There's not very many of them, and the biologists did a really good job trying to follow up. Check to see how the population was doing, check to see if there's drying in the watershed. Well, they did a couple rescues because it was drying up within different parts of the watershed. But then there was a major sand fire in Southern California, as a lot of you probably remember. And so then they were nervous. It's about, you have the fire, then you have all the sediment that's exposed. You don't have vegetation holding in the sediment. And so what they did was, by October 2016, they rescued them and they put them in the Fillmore hatchery. So by 2017, heavy rains came, and we had flash flows in Southern California, and it buried that area under 7 feet of ash and sediment. And if all of you could see that, the arrow there, that biologist on both slides, it's here and here. So that's those photos, that's the same perspective in the photo, and basically that biologist would be under sediment if that biologist were still standing out there. So basically you just basically saw fish habitat that's just covered in sediment. It's no longer there. So luckily these fish were relocated back to the hatchery for temporary holding, and then once conditions, it'll take a while for this to kind of clear out. So they ended up reintroducing the fish back into another area of the Santa Clara Valley, or Santa Clara watershed. So it's a good thing the biologists were out there keeping an eye on all this stuff, because all these species could easily blink out. So now we get into the discussion summary. So 2012 and 2016 showed record-breaking drought in California, especially in Southern Central Valley and the coastal areas. Monitoring was definitely an integral to understanding the effects of drought on aquatic species and for determining management actions. And then the patterns we have discussed that affect the fish survival are that streams dried earlier and longer, the estuaries of barbel lagoons exhibited degraded water quality, water temperatures rose sometimes to critical levels, wild trout populations in high elevation streams were threatened with anchor ice, and something to be thinking about in the future. And fish were often stranded by low stream flow and adversely affected by poor water quality. So in thinking about this, I kind of drafted up some lessons learned, at least my lessons in this process. And it actually kind of re-solidified ideas that I already had, which is long-term monitoring keeps us prepared to deal with the drought. It shows us how the animals are doing. That context I was talking about, where we just have a snapshot. To me, it's useful, but it's also painful because we don't really know what it means. We don't really know how much the streams are warming or how much they're drying if we don't have a series of long-term data sets. We don't know if the population is really blinking out when we just have these snapshots. If we don't have kind of the bell curve of how the population changes over time, it makes it really challenging. So monitoring can help us forecast for future scenarios, looking at survival and water temperatures. Linking monitoring with management can improve balance of resources. Extreme drought provided insight about key habitat that remains wetted. These are good sanctuary habitat to kind of think about in these extreme situations. Altered habitat from extreme drought has already begun to show us new possible threats that we need to address in terms of wildfires, mudslides, and flash flood and debris flows. So now we're ready to position ourselves for the future. We learned a lot in all this data we collected. We now have a monitoring baseline in places that we never had data before. We have a better understanding of refugia, and we have a forecast of the most at-risk populations we need to keep an eye on. And then, the obvious part of this is we need to start thinking about all this and thinking about how we can build for resiliency. So here are some recommendations for the future. Again, I keep harping on the long-term monitoring is important. And I'll harp to the biologists, including myself, is transparency and results. I think that's key. I liked how everyone worked together and we got this report done. 57 authors. I've never seen anything like that. I've never worked on anything like that before. We had 38 case studies on the internet. That kind of kept people. It was good for two reasons. It was good for for the sense of letting the public and our fellow scientists know what's going on. And it was also helpful, I think, it helped us avoid the work of getting all these phone calls because people had, from the press and from different people asking CDFW what's happening during the drought. They can look at the webpage. So it was good in communication and it was good in getting our information out. Partnerships are really important. There's a lot of people a lot of groups that work together, state, federal agencies, NGOs, private landowners let us on their property, which was really nice of them. Again, we need to build in resiliency, and we need to think of outside the box if we're going to keep these species sustainable. So now you guys are itching to look at the final report. You can find it online in our document library. Here's the address. And everyone's, the 57 authors are all listed in there as co-authors. So the case studies I was mentioning on the DFW website, here's the address there. And not only do we have the 38 drought stressor monitoring case studies, there's also case studies relative to other drought response projects, including fish rescues. And there's some cool videos that I mentioned. You can learn more about the golden trout rescue. There's a really good story. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk about on the McCloud River rescue of red-bound trout in the headwaters there. And I guess there's two videos on the California golden trout. So check those out. And if you're interested in looking at the raw data, that's now viewable as well. That's on the CDFW's BIOS website. And so you can go and you can click on your geographic area and you can see all that data that you're sending to me up there. And again, I want to acknowledge state, federal agencies, local agencies, nonprofit organizations, private landowners, and anyone else I've missed. That will leave with questions. Any comments from people that were part of the drought stressor monitoring project? It was quite the whirlwind. It almost seems like we needed one of these meetings to kind of discuss how it went afterwards, kind of a debrief.
Nice job tying it all together.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, thank you.
Herding the cat.
And this was only one of my projects. One of my other projects.
I have a question. One of the recommendations was to continue long-term monitoring. Is that happening?
To rephrase for the folks on the phone, or just kind of paraphrase for the folks on the phone the question. Just paraphrase the question for the folks on the phone so they can hear you.
So the question is there long-term monitoring being implemented? In some cases, so for speaking for CDFW, since I did this project for them, so that's always a challenge because there isn't enough funding for monitoring, and so what CDFW is doing is they worked with the regions and they kind of came up with priority watersheds, and so the limiting funding that comes in goes to those watersheds, and at this point some of the watersheds that the key thing is showing reporting your results and already having monitoring in places. Those places are more likely to get funding, but a lot of these places that were monitored for drought, I wouldn't be surprised. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, but a bunch of those probably are not being monitored right now. I'm guessing. But that was always something that I was asking, in these monthly coordination meetings: has anyone stopped monitoring? Because the idea is, even when it's raining and the flows are better, you need that context. You can't just go there and do snapshots during the drought. You need to show the good water, the good conditions and the bad conditions, because that builds in context for us to know what's going on. But yeah, that's the challenge is there's not enough resources so far for long-term monitoring in a lot of places.
I have a question for you. You talked about early on, I think towards the beginning of the drought, identifying areas that would potentially serve as refugia. Did I hear that right? Did those pan out in terms of, did they actually serve as refugia for the duration of the drought in most cases, or what did you see?
So what I found in talking to biologists and reading reports, I think the challenge was I think that some places they thought were refugia were suddenly no longer refugia as the drought kept continuing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what was helpful maybe in kind of the long-term monitoring, seeing what ultimately was kind of the more solid refugia. It was just fewer and fewer with the streams drying up.
That would be good information to have too in the context of longer term climate change planning. I was thinking that term refugia comes up a lot, so it would be interesting to see how that actually played out during the drought. And now we have some observations related to that. That's really interesting to have.
Right.
We have a question on the phone.
Okay.
It says the intro slide included a photo of a yellow-legged frog. All examples were fish. Do you have any non-fish stories?
Well, yes, the one non-fish was the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog. So I apologize, I didn't talk about that in this talk. More of the focus was on the fishes in California. So there was a biologist in CDFW Region 6 out of the Bishop office, and what she was doing was she was taking opportunity of the low stream flows and kind of the drying conditions in the high elevation Sierra where the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog live. And so she was actually, so in those locations, fish weren't native to those areas. These were glaciated areas. And so, for recreational purposes, some of these areas, these bodies of water were planted with fish. And so what she was doing during these drought conditions is lakes that she thought could never be restored for the frogs, again, balancing frogs and where the frogs are and where the fish habitat is. She was going in there and she was making barriers to kind of lock off certain lakes so she can do treatments to reduce, to eliminate fish from these ponds that didn't have fish before. The idea is you remove the fish and then the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog population could bounce back in those bodies of water. And there's a case study on that on the website, so so welcome to go check that out.
Were any of the biologists collecting amphibian observations? Were they recorded at all during this?
So the question was, were there any biologists collecting amphibian information? And the answer is I don't really know the depth of amphibian data that was collected. So in California Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's fisheries branch and there's a wildlife branch, and traditionally it's the wildlife branch that kind of deals with the amphibian and reptile portion, and so I would defer to that branch. Is anyone here from wildlife branch that could help with that?
Yes, I read.
Any other questions for Chrissy?
All right. Nope, one in the back.
See you there. So you talked a little bit about standardization throughout the
Yeah.
state. How do you think you could do that in the future, and what sort of things popped out that you think you could standardize through these different regions and different parts of the state?
Right. So I guess there's a couple things to it. Actually, California Fish and Wildlife actually has a whole bunch of different monitoring plans that have been created called the California Monitoring Plan, Fish Bulletin 180. There's a Central Valley monitoring. There's different plans that are out there, and part of it is just is fully implementing, fully funding, fully staffing these programs. That would be. I remember because I was the lead of the California Coastal Monitoring Plan, and I kept kicking myself, thinking, boy, if we had that fully functioning, I wouldn't have to be scurrying around and trying to get data in piecemeal, and it would have made my life a lot easier. But the case was it's not fully implemented, especially to the south. And so we worked with what we had. The other piece that would have been nice to have is some sort of standardization of the way temperature was collected. Maybe that'd be kind of a first thing to kind of get an idea of if streams are warming. But again, that's a huge operation. You're working with staff across the state with different resources, and it wasn't like Fisheries Branch in Sacramento was directing. I was just merely the lead and the coordinator, and so these people report to different people. They have other, regional priorities that are important too, and so this was kind of, they're doing this extra work, and I was doing extra work, so this was quite the big undertaking. I think to people that aren't fisheries biologists in CDFW, I think if I was a member of the general public, I probably would expect that this information is readily available. But working for the department, it's not, and there's a reason for it. There's not a lot of information out there, and it's there's lack of resources often.
There you go. All right, thank you so much, Chrissy. We appreciate it. Yeah. And thank you everyone for joining. Don't forget, next lecture, September 10th from 1 to 3 p.m. and registration is now open. So we'll hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
What's the next lecture?